In 1951, a man walked up to home plate in a Major League Baseball game. He was wearing a real uniform, he had a real, signed, league-approved contract, he was, in every legal sense, a professional baseball player, and he was also 3 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 65 pounds. The crowd erupted. The umpire stopped the game in disbelief. The opposing pitcher started laughing. And what happened over the next 4 pitches became one of the most famous moments in the history of the sport, and got the rulebook rewritten overnight. This is the story of Eddie Gaedel, the shortest player to ever appear in a major league game. A man who came to the plate exactly once, never swung the bat, and walked away with a record that has stood for more than 70 years and will almost certainly never be broken. It's a story about a desperate team, a genius troublemaker, and a single loophole so perfect that baseball had no choice but to allow it. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the man who made it happen. His name was Bill Veeck, and he was the most creative, most provocative team owner baseball had ever seen. In 1951, Veeck bought the St. Louis Browns, and the Browns were, to put it gently, a disaster. They lost constantly. They shared a city and a stadium with the far more popular St. Louis Cardinals, and most days, the Browns played in front of a sea of empty seats. Veeck needed people in those seats. He needed buzz. He needed something nobody had ever seen before. And that was exactly how Veeck thought about his job. He had a personal philosophy that defined his entire career, and it's worth hearing in his own words. He said, quote, "I try not to break the rules, but merely to test their elasticity." Test their elasticity. Remember that phrase, because everything that follows is built on it. Veeck sat down and asked himself a simple question. What could he possibly do that was so spectacular, so unprecedented, that no fan in the stadium could ever say they'd seen it before? And the answer he landed on was so outrageous that, in his own retelling, it was almost obvious to him. He decided he would send a very small man up to bat in a real major league game. Not as a joke between innings, not as a sideshow, as an actual official player. The man Veeck found was named Eddie Gaedel. Gaedel was 26 years old. He stood 3 foot 7 inches tall and weighed about 65 pounds. He was a performer by trade, and Veeck tracked him down through a talent booking agent. Now, here's where most people misunderstand this story. They assume Veeck just grabbed a guy, stuck him in a uniform, and snuck him onto the field as a prank. But that's not what happened at all. And the difference is the entire point. Because Veeck did something much smarter. He signed Eddie Gaedel to a real standard, completely valid major league contract. The deal was worth a little over $15,000 on paper, which worked out to about $100 for a single game's appearance. Veeck filed the paperwork quietly, late on a Friday afternoon, 2 days before the game. This was the loophole. This was the whole trick. In the eyes of the rules, Eddie Gaedel was not a stunt. He was a legally contracted, roster-eligible professional baseball player. And there was nothing in the rulebook that said a player had to be a certain height. Veeck hadn't broken a single rule. He just found the place where the rules were silent, and he drove a truck straight through it. Then came the hard part, keeping it a secret. If word got out before game day, the league would shut it down, so the operation went undercover. Gaedel was picked up at his home in Chicago, driven to St. Louis, and smuggled into the team's hotel, reportedly wrapped in a blanket so no one would see him. Only a tiny handful of people knew what was about to happen. The date was August 19th, 1951, a Sunday, a doubleheader against the Detroit Tigers with more than 18,000 fans in the stands. Veeck had promoted the day heavily. He'd promised the crowd a festival of surprises, tying it to the 50th anniversary of the American League and a celebration for one of his sponsors, the Falstaff Brewing Company. And between 2 games of the doubleheader, Veeck delivered a whole circus of entertainment. Jugglers, acrobats, a band, clowns, even the legendary pitcher Satchel Paige playing the drums. And then came the big reveal. A giant birthday cake was wheeled onto the field, and out of the cake popped Eddie Gaedel, in a full Browns uniform, waving his cap to the crowd. The fans laughed and clapped. The press, though, was unimpressed. Reports figured the man in the cake gag was a little beneath Veeck's usual standards. Even the sponsor was annoyed. They'd been promised something spectacular, and this fell flat. Veeck just quietly, almost meekly, apologized. Here's the genius of it, though. The cake wasn't the stunt. The cake was the disguise. Nobody in that stadium understood what they'd just seen. They thought Gaedel popping out of a cake in a uniform was the joke. They had no idea that the uniform was real. That at that very moment, Eddie Gaedel was officially a member of the St. Louis Browns, and the actual surprise was still coming in the game itself. The second game began. Bottom of the first inning. The Browns' leadoff hitter was due up, a player named Frank Saucier. But before Saucier could bat, the public address announcer informed the crowd that the Browns were sending up a pinch hitter. And out of the dugout came Eddie Gaedel, swinging 3 tiny bats, wearing a uniform with the number 1/8 on the back. Not number 1, not number 8, the fraction 1/8. The crowd, realizing what was happening, gave him a standing ovation. The home plate umpire, a man named Ed Hurley, was not nearly as delighted. He took one look at this and immediately stopped the game, demanding to know what on earth was going on. He called the Browns manager out of the dugout for an explanation. And this is the moment Veeck had prepared for, because the manager came out holding 2 documents, a copy of Eddie Gaedel's signed major league contract and a copy of the Browns' active roster with Gaedel's name properly on it. There was nothing the umpire could do. The contract was real, the roster spot was real. By the letter of the law, Eddie Gaedel was an eligible major league player who had every right to be standing on that plate. Hurley, fuming, had to wave him in. Now, Gaedel had one job. Veeck had given him strict instructions: do not swing the bat. Under any circumstances, just stand there. And that's exactly what he did. Crouched in his tiny stance, Gaedel's strike zone was almost impossible to find. A target maybe an inch or 2 tall. The Tigers pitcher Bob Kane reportedly couldn't help laughing at the absurdity of it as he tried to throw strikes to a man the size of a child. 4 pitches went by, all 4 were balls. Eddie Gaedel had drawn a walk. He tossed his bat aside and trotted down to first base, the crowd roaring. And then, his work done, he was immediately lifted for a pinch runner and he walked off the field, to the biggest ovation of the day. The league was not amused. The very next day, the president of the American League, a man named Will Harridge, moved to stamp it out. He declared that nothing like Eddie Gaedel's at-bat would ever be allowed to happen again. And he tried to go a step further. He ordered that Gaedel's appearance be wiped from the official record books entirely, as if it had never happened. He got half of his wish. Yes, the loophole was closed. From that point on, player contracts required league approval before a player could take the field, specifically so that no owner could ever pull a Veeck again. The era of sending a 65-pound man to the plate was over before it had really begun. But the second half of Harridge's wish, erasing Eddie Gaedel from history, that failed completely, because the public loved this story too much to let it disappear. And so, to this day, Eddie Gaedel remains in baseball's official record, with what might be the most beautiful stat line the game has ever produced. 1 game, 1 plate appearance, 1 walk, 0 times put out. A career on-base percentage of a perfect 1.000. He reached base in 100% of his major league opportunities. No Hall of Famer can say that. Nobody can. Here's the part that surprises people most. Eddie Gaedel was paid $100 for that single at-bat, but the appearance made him briefly famous, and the offers came pouring in. He reportedly earned around $17,000 from television appearances in the aftermath, more than 100 times what the at-bat itself paid. And Eddie became immortal. More than 70 years later, he is still the shortest player in the history of Major League Baseball. His tiny figure is even displayed in the Baseball Hall of Fame, often placed right next to the uniform of the tallest player in big league history. The 2 extremes of the game, side by side. Bill Veeck went on to a Hall of Fame career as an owner, famous for dozens of wild promotions, but of everything he ever did, the man in the 1/8 jersey is the one people never forget. Because it's the perfect story, A losing team, a genius willing to test exactly how far the rules could stretch, a loophole nobody else had ever thought to look for, and one ordinary man, 3 foot 7 inches tall, who walked up to the plate once, never swung, and walked straight into baseball history. If you enjoyed this one, there are dozens more stories like it. Moments sports history almost forgot. Subscribe, and I'll keep digging them up.